The day my grandfather died, my mother was already planning how to spend his money. She did not know he had been recording her for 2 years. Did not know his attorney had a manila envelope sitting on that conference table, sealed, waiting with my name on it. And she did not know that the night I called her from a hospital bed with a shattered leg, begging for someone to just show up, my grandfather heard every single word she said to me. He never told me. He just quietly rewrote his will and left her $1. If you have ever been the strong one, the one who handles everything alone while everyone else looks the other way, this story is for you. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply pay attention to who shows up, keep the evidence, and trust that the truth does not need your help to survive. It just needs time. If this story hit something real for you, leave a comment below and tell me who showed up for you when it cost them something. Those stories matter. The people in them deserve to be remembered. If you are new here, subscribe. Not for the numbers, because there are more stories like this one, stories about dignity, about what family actually means, and about the quiet kind of strength that does not need an audience to be real. Like this video if it gave you something to think about. Share it with someone who has been carrying too much for too long. And if you have ever been told you are the strong one by people who used that word so they would not have to show up, share it for them. They have earned the reminder.
The moment Jim Whitfield slid that manila envelope across the conference table, my father's attorney stopped talking mid-sentence. He picked it up, read the first page, set it back down. He did not read the second page. He simply closed his leather portfolio, straightened his tie. Father, the way doctors look at patients right before they deliver news, the patient is not going to survive emotionally. My mother's hands were trembling, not dramatically, just enough that the water glass in front of her made a small, steady sound against the table, like a clock that wouldn't stop. My sister Brittany had put her phone face down. That alone told you more than anything else in that room. And my father, the man who had spent the previous 40 minutes leaning back in his chair with the posture of someone who believed the outcome was already decided, slowly turned to look at me. I did not say anything. I did not smile. I did not reach across the table. I did not perform. Because here is the thing about growing up with a man like Arthur Hayes as your grandfather. You learn early that the most dangerous person in any room is never the loudest one. It is the one who prepared. And my grandfather, the man that people in Dayton, Ohio had called Big Art for 60 years, had been preparing for this exact moment for a very long time. He had not lived to see it happen, but he had made absolutely certain that it would. To understand why that envelope existed, why my father's attorney went quiet, why my mother's hands shook, you need to go back to the beginning. Not to the reading of the will, not to the funeral. Back to a Thursday night in March, a wet 2-lane road outside Columbus, and the moment a drunk driver running a red light at nearly 60 miles an hour changed everything, including my family's willingness to show me exactly who they were. My name is Rachel Hayes. I am 38 years old. I spent 10 years as a logistics officer in the United States Army, which means I spent 10 years solving problems that other people created, under conditions that would overwhelm most people, without asking for help and without expecting a thank you. I was good at it. The reason I was good at it, the reason I had trained myself since childhood to manage crises alone, to absorb damage quietly, to be the dependable one in every room, had a name. That name was the same word my family had been using to avoid showing up for me since I was 11 years old. Strong. My sister Brittany is 4 years younger. She has built a career on the internet, selling an image of warmth and authenticity to 140,000 followers who have never met her in person. The Brittany they follow is a better version than the one I grew up with. My parents, Diana and Frank Hayes, live in Carterville, Ohio. In the house I grew up in, my mother is the kind of woman who knows everyone within 20 miles, organizes the church directory, and performs warmth at a professional level. My father has been renovating the back deck for 11 years. Neither of them has ever asked about my deployments and genuinely meant the question. These are not complaints. They are a record. And in this story, the record matters because the one person in my family who was always, consistently, genuinely interested in my actual life was my grandfather, Arthur James Hayes, 82 years old, 6 feet and 1 inch. Former owner of Hayes Construction and Transport, one of the largest privately held trucking and construction companies in the Dayton corridor from 1962 to 1994. The man people called Big Art. I want to be honest about who he was, because the story does not make sense without it. Arthur Hayes built his company from one second-hand flatbed truck and a handshake loan from a man whose name he never spoke in polite company. By the late 1970s, Hayes Construction had 1,400 employees, state contracts, and a reputation for finishing on time, under budget, and without complications in an industry where complications were the standard operating model. The FBI investigated Hayes Construction twice, in 1979 and again in 1986. Neither investigation produced charges. According to things my grandfather told me, over the years, in his sideways way of saying important things, was an education. He sold the company in 1994. He bought 72 acres of commercial land on the Route 9 corridor outside Dayton. Land that nobody else wanted because the highway expansion that would triple its value had not been announced yet. He moved into a modest ranch house. He drove a 2003 Ford pickup until the year he died. Quietly, a network of relationships with attorneys, county officials, and men who owed him favors going back 30 years. His calls were always returned. His documents were always processed. His interests were always protected. He was not sentimental, but he called me every Sunday at 6 in the evening for 15 years. He knew the names of my soldiers. He came to my commission ceremony and stayed for the entire thing. When my parents left after 45 minutes for Brittany's volleyball tournament, he took me to dinner after and talked with me for 3 hours. Before we left the restaurant, he said something I thought was a compliment. It took me 20 years to understand it was also a warning. He said, "You are going to be fine, Rachel. Not because it will be easy, because you are the kind of person who does not need it to be." The accident happened on a Thursday in March at 11:47 at night on Route 40. Heading back to Columbus from a friend's birthday dinner. The driver of the other vehicle ran a red light at 58 miles an hour with a blood alcohol level of 0.24. He walked away with a fractured wrist. I woke up in the ambulance. The paramedic told me my right leg had sustained multiple fractures. My right clavicle was cracked. The laceration above my left ear had bled considerably but was not serious. My first thought was about my dog, Biscuit, a 7-year-old beagle mix who was home alone and had not been fed since 8 that evening. My second thought was that my phone had 40% battery. By the time they had me in room 312 at Grant Medical Center, right leg in a full cast, shoulder immobilized, IV in my left arm, it was nearly 1 in the morning. The night nurse, Ruth, taped my charger to the bed rail without being asked. I lay there looking at the ceiling tiles for a while. Then I opened my contacts and I pressed call. My mother answered on the 5th ring. Rachel. Flat, not alarmed. Mom, I'm in the hospital. Drunk driver. My leg is broken in multiple places. My collarbone is cracked. Silence. Are you stable? Not, I'm coming. Not, which hospital? Not, oh my God. Are you stable? Like she was assessing a report from a comfortable distance. Yes, but I'm alone, and Biscuit is home. I heard something on her end, a television being muted, the sound of inconvenience being registered. We're in Carterville. That's 40 minutes. I know how far it is. Rachel, it's 1 in the morning. I know what time it is. I'm asking if someone can come sit with me. A pause. Then the pivot, the one she made whenever she was shifting from feeling guilty to feeling wronged, which in Diana Hayes took approximately 4 seconds. Brittany has her partnership shoot tomorrow, the Ellsworth Home Collection. This is a $30,000 contract, Rachel. She cannot show up tired. I looked at the water stain on the ceiling tile. It was shaped like the state of Florida. Mom, my leg is in pieces. You have doctors. You said you're stable. I want my family. The silence that followed was the specific silence my mother used when she was preparing her next position. You have always handled things yourself. That is who you are. You are the strong one in this family, Rachel. And there it was. The sentence. The one that had explained everything my entire life. The one that meant, translated honestly, we do not have to show up for you because you survive without it. I said, okay, Mom, she said. Get some rest. She hung up. I put the phone down on the blanket. I did not cry. I did not call back. I did what Army logistics officers do when a situation goes wrong in the field. I counted my resources. I identified my gaps. I adjusted. And for the first time in my life, clearly and without the protection of hope, I removed my family from the column marked available resources. Then I sent 2 texts, one to my best friend, Carol Bennett, an ER nurse who has been my best friend since freshman orientation at Ohio State, who responds to the phrase not urgent, but could use a person's the way most people respond to a fire alarm. One to my former sergeant, Tom Greer, who lives 12 minutes from my house and has a spare key because I once locked myself out in a January ice storm and he drove over at midnight without being asked. By 2:15, Tom had sent me a photo of Biscuit sitting on his couch wearing a children's Halloween costume, a hot dog. The caption read, "He came with this on. I have questions." I laughed so hard it hurt my shoulder. 2:45. Carol was standing in my doorway with real coffee from the place on 4th Street she knew I preferred, looking at the cast and the brace and the IV, with the expression of a woman who had assessed everything and chosen warmth over alarm. She pulled the chair close, and she said, the thing she always said when noise needed cutting through. Tell me what is actually going on. And I did. For the first time since the impact, I stopped managing the situation. I just talked. Carol held my hand and did not offer solutions and did not minimize and did not perform sympathy for an audience that wasn't there. She simply listened, which is the rarest and most valuable thing one human being can do for another. The next afternoon, I had a visitor I was not expecting. I heard him before I saw him, not because he was loud, because when Arthur Hayes walked into a room, even at 82, even with a hickory cane, the air changed. Something in the rhythm of his movement, deliberate, unhurried. The walk of a man who had decided decades ago that urgency was a weakness other people performed. He stepped into room 312, carrying a brown paper bag containing a gas station sandwich, black coffee, 2 bags of peanut butter crackers, and a deck of cards. He surveyed the room in 5 seconds. The cast. The brace, the IV, Carol in the chair. He said nothing. He set the bag on the table, pulled the second chair close, sat down carefully, and looked at me with the gray-blue eyes he had passed down to me. Your mother didn't come, he said. She had things. I know what she had. He opened the deck of cards, began to shuffle. The sound was familiar. He had played gin rummy with me since I was 6 years old, and the shuffle was exactly the same. Grandpa, how did you know I was here? He looked up briefly. I know what happens to my people. He dealt 2 hands without asking if I wanted to play. We played for 2 hours. He beat me 4 out of 6 games. Carol won 2 that she claimed did not count because she was learning. Grandpa told her everything counted. That was the whole point of keeping score. When he stood to leave, he put his hand on top of mine. The rough, scarred hand of a man who had built things with it for 50 years. He held it there. You called her, he said. Yes. What did she say? That I'm the strong one. He was quiet for a long moment. Being called strong by people who benefit from your strength is not a compliment, Rachel. It is a business arrangement, one you never agreed to. He picked up his cane. Pay attention to who shows up. Write it down if you have to. The evidence you gather in difficult moments is the most important evidence there is. I thought that was advice. It was not advice. It was instructions. 3 months into recovery, I was walking with a cane and working from home when Carol called on a Tuesday afternoon with her careful voice. Can you come over tonight? There is something I need to tell you in person. What Carol had learned through a colleague whose contact worked in the county assessor's office was that 2 separate parties had requested property valuations on the Route 9 land in the past 60 days. One was a Cincinnati development company. The other was filed by an attorney on behalf of Frank and Diana Hayes. My parents were getting appraisals on land my grandfather was still alive to own. I drove to Carterville the next morning. Grandpa was on the porch when I pulled up, waiting. Like he knew I was coming, which, knowing Arthur Hayes, he very possibly did. He poured coffee from a thermos, handed me a mug, waited. "Were you going to tell me?" I asked. "Tell you what?" "That my parents have been getting appraisals on your property." He looked out toward Route 9. The corridor was visible from the porch, traffic moving past land that had been worth modest amounts when he bought it and was now worth something considerably different. "I already knew," he said, "for about 18 months. He sipped his coffee. "Your mother has been managing a story about my health for 2 years. That I am confused. That I need help. That the land is too much for me alone." He said this without bitterness, like a man reading from a document. "She spoke with my doctor's receptionist 6 months ago. She sent your father to inquire with my attorney about legal guardianships proceedings. She did both of these things while telling her friends at church that she was very concerned about my well-being." I stared at him. "I've been handling people who underestimate me since before your mother was born," he said. "The difference is that I started keeping records a very long time ago." Old habit. He stood and walked inside. He came back carrying a banker's box. He set it on the table between us. "I've worked with Jim Whitfield for 40 years, he said. "In the last 2 years, we have been working on this." Inside the box were organized files, visitor logs, dated and timed and annotated, transcriptions of phone calls, copies of documents his doctor's office had flagged as unusual inquiries, a letter from the county assessor, correspondence between my father and the attorney's office. At the bottom, a manila envelope in Arthur's handwriting. "For the meeting." "What is in the envelope?" I asked. "Insurance," he said, "for you. Not for me." He looked at me across the box. "Rachel, I am going to die. Not today, not next month, but I am not a man who pretends otherwise. When I do, your family is going to move quickly. They have already been planning. What they do not know is that I have been planning longer." He placed his hand on the lid of the box. "Everything is already done. Jim has the rest. I needed you to understand before it happens that you were never the afterthought they made you feel like." I looked at the box. I looked at my grandfather, 82 years old, in a flannel shirt with a grease stain on the sleeve, on a porch he had built himself in 1974. "What if they challenge it?" I asked. He smiled. Not a warm smile. The smile of a man who had been asked a question he had already answered in writing, with witnesses, and notarized. "Let them try." 6 weeks after that conversation on the porch, I discovered something that had not been in the box. Through Carol, who knew someone who worked in county records, I obtained a copy of a document submitted to the probate court, a power of attorney, dated 4 months earlier, bearing Arthur Hayes' signature. I sat in my car outside the post office and stared at it for a long time. Arthur Hayes had the handwriting of a man who had signed contracts in rooms where signatures had consequences, large, angular, controlled. The capital A in Arthur had a very specific second stroke that I had seen my entire life. This signature had the right letters. It did not have the right second stroke. I called Jim Whitfield. "I have a copy of a power of attorney filed by my parents. It has my grandfather's signature." Pause. "Does that signature look like his to you?" "No." "That is consistent with the findings of the forensic document examiner Arthur retained 8 months ago. The document was reported to the county prosecutor in February. An investigation is currently open." I sat very still. He already knew. He anticipated it. "Rachel, your grandfather has been building this case for 2 years. Every visit your parents made is logged. Every inappropriate inquiry to his medical team is documented. Every attempt to access his financial records is on file. Why didn't he tell me sooner?" "Because he did not want you carrying it. He wanted to carry it himself." I put my head back against the headrest and sat in that parking lot for 40 minutes, not processing the forgery. I had been trained to process worse. But because something settled on me there, in that parking lot, that had no military equivalent. My mother had forged my grandfather's signature. My family had tried, systematically and deliberately, to strip an 82-year-old man of his legal autonomy Not because he needed help, but because they wanted his monies before he could give it to someone they did not approve of. And that someone, I was now entirely certain, was me, which meant this was not only about the estate. This was about 38 years. Every school event Diana had left early. Every holiday that revolved around Brittany. Every time I had been the strong one and quietly recalibrated my expectations and told myself it was fine. It was fine. It was not what it looked like. It was exactly what it looked like. That night, Carol sat across from me at my kitchen table. You have spent so long being strong for people who treat your strength as a resource they are entitled to use, she said. You do not have to stop being strong. You just have to stop donating it to people who have never once said, thank you. I looked at my hands around my coffee mug. How do you let go of something that large? Slowly, she said. Then, all at once, like most important things. 2 weeks before my grandfather passed, I discovered the final piece. Ashley Drummond had been my closest friend from middle school through college. We had drifted but stayed connected, the way people do. She had always been the person I called when I needed to talk to someone who knew me before the army and before Columbus. During my grandfather's hospitalization, I had called her once, just to talk. And I had mentioned, because I was tired and she seemed warm, that I had been spending time with Grandpa, that he seemed to be settling something about the future. Nothing specific, just enough. My friend Megan texted me a screenshot 3 days before Grandpa died. Diana Hayes had been at Ashley's birthday dinner, seated next to her, laughing at something on her phone. I called Ashley directly. She answered on the second ring. The hello was one note too high. How long? I said. Rachel, how long have you been talking to my mother? The pause told me everything before she said a word. She called me about a year ago. She said she was worried about you, that you were spending too much time with your grandfather, and she thought you might be isolating. What did you tell her? Silence. Ashley, I told her about your Sunday calls, about you being close to him, about feeling like he trusted you specifically. I sat in my kitchen and looked at the maple tree outside the window and thought, there is nothing in this room that looks like how I feel right now. My mother was not worried about me, I said quietly. She was worried about the will. You gave her a timeline. You told her when to start moving. I ended the call. I did not call back. That evening I drove to Carterville. Grandpa was in the hospital by then. The doctors were honest about what it meant. He was slower. The physical scale of him had reduced. But his eyes, the gray-blue eyes he had passed to me, were the same. I sat beside his bed. I held his hand. I think I finally understand what you have been doing, I said. He looked at me. The records, the attorney, 2 years of preparation. You were not just protecting the estate. You were building the evidence. He squeezed my hand. You were never the strong one, Rachel. That was a story they told so they would not have to show up. You were the capable one. Those are different things. Capable means you can manage without help. It does not mean you should have to. I know that now. Good. He looked at the window. The envelope. Do not open it before the meeting. I need you to walk in without knowing everything, so they cannot read it on your face. Why? Because I need them to believe they have won, right up until they have not. He squeezed my hand one last time. Trust the preparation. He passed away 9 days later. I was with him. My parents found out by phone. I will not spend much time on the funeral. Diana Hayes grieved loudly and publicly at St. Michael's in Carterville, drawing people to her with the gravitational pull of someone who had been rehearsing loss her whole life. She told anyone who would listen about Arthur's dependence on the family in his final years, the burden she and Frank had carried quietly and without complaint. Brittany posted a tribute. She checked her analytics during the reception. Frank shook hands and looked solemn and contributed nothing, as was his custom. At the reception in the church hall, my mother gathered relatives the way she always did, with warmth and the implicit offer of inside information. Arthur always said the property should stay with family. I heard her tell my Aunt Linda, he depended on us so much. We managed everything for him. From my position near the window, I watched her rewrite reality with the calm efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years. Jim Whitfield appeared beside me. He did not make eye contact. "Thursday at 9, he said quietly. "Arrive on time. Things need to happen in a specific order." "What should I expect?" "Expect your family to have retained someone. Expect an attempt to introduce documents early. Expect it to fail." A pause. "Your grandfather was thorough, Rachel. More thorough than they know. Trust the preparation." Walked away before I could respond. Across the room, my mother was still talking, still performing, still shopping a future that did not belong to her yet. And I thought, she has no idea what he built. Thursday morning, 9 a.m. Whitfield and Associates, downtown Dayton. Carol drove me. She sat in the lobby downstairs with a thermos and a book. "However long it takes," she said. When I opened the conference room door, I understood immediately that something was wrong. My family was seated. Diana, Frank, Brittany, and her husband Jake. Expected. What was not expected was the man at the far end of the table. 50s, expensive suit, leather portfolio. Brittany smiled when she saw me had edges sharp enough to cut. "Rachel, we were starting to think you were not coming. I am right on time." The man's stood. "Warren Cole. I am representing the Hayes family in this proceeding." My mother's voice was the specific warmth she used when she had already won. "Just a precaution, Rachel. Family matters can get complicated." I sat, spine straight, hands flat on the table. Jim Whitfield entered at exactly 9 o'clock. No briefcase. The blue folder under his arm. He opened it and prepared to begin. Warren Cole stood immediately. "Before we proceed, Mr. Whitfield, I need to enter into the record a power of attorney document executed by Arthur Hayes, transferring financial authority to Diana and Frank Hayes, given his documented cognitive decline." He slid the document across the table. Jim Whitfield picked it up. "Read the first page." Set it down. For 7 full seconds, he said nothing. My mother allowed herself a small smile. My father's shoulders dropped with visible relief, and I thought, there it is. The second document. The one they saved. The one I did not know about. It's over. Those 7 seconds lasted longer than anything in my life. Then Jim Whitfield set down the document, stood, and walked to the credenza along the far wall. He picked up the manila envelope that had been sitting there the entire time. Arthur Hayes's handwriting on the front. For the meeting. He brought it to the table, sat down, and opened it. He laid the contents out in a row, not dramatically, the way you lay out tools before a job you have done before. The first document was a letter from the forensic document examiner Arthur had retained 8 months earlier. 3 pages. Detailed analysis of the exact power of attorney Warren Cole had just presented. Signature comparison, ink analysis, dating inconsistencies. Conclusion. The signature does not match authenticated samples of Arthur James Hayes. The document was not signed by the named party. Warren Cole picked it up. He read it. He read it again. The complete forensic file, Jim said, was submitted to the Montgomery County Prosecutor's Office on March 3rd. The investigation is ongoing. My mother's smile had changed shape. Jim placed the second document on the table. A sworn statement from Arthur's neurologist, attesting that Arthur Hayes demonstrated full cognitive capacity and legal lucidity at every documented appointment, including the appointment 3 weeks before his death. Frank rubbed both hands across his face. The third document. This is a log of all visits to Arthur Hayes's property over the past 26 months. Dates, times, identities, and, in certain cases, transcriptions of conversations that took place on the property. He set it face up on the table. Arthur maintained a recording system on his property for the last 2.5 years. His property, his knowledge, his legal right. Selected recordings relevant to this proceeding are logged and preserved. The recordings document several conversations, including one in Arthur's kitchen between Diana Hayes and a third party, in which his competency was discussed in terms inconsistent with his documented medical record. Brittany put her phone face down. "Mrs. Hayes," Jim said, his voice unchanged in volume or temperature, "I would recommend speaking with your attorney before making any statement." Warren Cole had not spoken in 4 minutes. He was reading the forensic letter for the 3rd time. Jim reached into the folder, One final document, Arthur James Hayes's final will and testament, is executed 14 months ago, reviewed and confirmed by Arthur personally 3 weeks before his death, witnessed, notarized, complete. He opened it and read the tissist, the 72 acres on Route 9, the investment accounts, the retirement portfolio, the personal assets, total current valuation, $4,340,000. To Diana Hayes, Frank Hayes, and Brittany Hayes Crawford, 3 people who had, in Arthur's words, demonstrated through consistent action over many years that their relationship to this family was primarily transactional, the sum of $1 each. My mother stood up. The chair caught on the carpet, and she grabbed it. He would never. He did, Jim said. He did not understand what he was signing. His neurologist has documented otherwise. This is her doing. She pointed at me. Her voice cracked. The performance was gone. What was left was just a person who had wanted something and been told no. Mom, I said quietly. She looked at me. I did not do anything. I never had to. Warren Cole opened his portfolio, closed it again. We will challenge this, my father said, flat and cornered. We will take this to court. Jim Whitfield turned one more page. Article 9 of Arthur Hayes's final will includes a no-contest provision. Any beneficiary who files a legal challenge forfeits their designated inheritance upon filing. Frank blinked. What inheritance? It is $1. Correct, Jim said. You would forfeit your dollar. The silence that followed was almost perfect. Then Jim placed one final item on the table. Not a document. A handwritten note on plain paper. He slid it to Warren Cole. Warren Cole read it. His expression completed its journey from professional confidence to something closer to resignation. He folded the note and placed it in his portfolio. He said, Frank, Diana, I will call you this afternoon. He collected his things and left the room without looking at anyone. The remainder of the estate, Jim said, his voice the same steady instrument it had been for the past 90 minutes, including the 72-acre Route 9 property. All investment accounts, liquid assets, and personal property passes solely and irrevocably to Rachel Ann Hayes. My mother sat back down. She looked at me, and for the first time in my life, Diana Hayes had nothing to perform. The calculation was visible on her face. She was trying to figure out how much I knew, how much was on file, how much Arthur had recorded. She was doing what my grandfather had done. She was assessing the evidence, and she was realizing, for the first time, that she had been outprepared by 30 years. He always favored you, she said. He showed up for me, I said. That is a different thing. She left without another word. Frank followed. Brittany stood at the door and looked back at me once. Did you know? She said. The whole time, I knew something was coming. I did not know what. You could have warned us. I looked at her. Would you have changed anything? She did not answer. We both knew why. Jim Whitfield organized the documents back into the folder. Your grandfather also left a personal letter for you, he said. Not for the record, just for you. He slid a cream envelope across the table. Arthur Hayes's handwriting. Rachel, when you are ready. I put it in my jacket pocket. One more thing, I said. The community college in Dayton. I want to establish a scholarship in his name. Construction management, logistics, engineering. For students who are building something. Jim allowed himself the smallest possible expression of professional satisfaction. I will draw up the paperwork. Carol was in the lobby when I came out of the elevator. She looked at my face, not my expression, my whole face. Done, she said. Done. We walked to the car. The October air was cold and clean. Biscuit was at Tom's place. Arthur's letter was in my pocket. In the car, she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. Like I watched 60 years of preparation do exactly what it was designed to do. And like I do not know what to do with the rest of the afternoon. She laughed. I have suggestions, starting with actual food. We went to the diner on 5th Street, where we had been going since college. We ordered too much and ate most of it. Carol told a story about a patient who had tried to argue with her about his own blood pressure using information from a website that also sold crystals. I laughed until my shoulder reminded me it had opinions about sudden movement. It was the most ordinary 2 hours I had experienced in months. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with Biscuit across my feet and the October dark outside the window. and I opened Arthur's letter. I am not going to tell you everything it said. Some things belong only to the relationship they came from. But the last line was this. In Arthur Hayes's angular handwriting, the capital A with the second stroke I had known my whole life, it said, I kept records of everything, but the only record I ever cared about was who showed up. You always showed up, Rachel, even when you did not know I was keeping score. That is why I sat with that for a long time. Then I called Tom to check on Biscuit. He said Biscuit had stolen 2 socks and shown no remorse whatsoever. I said that tracked completely. I put the letter back in the envelope and placed it in the drawer of my desks, where I sit when I am working, not framed. Arthur would have found that embarrassing. Just there in the drawer, available on the days when I need to remember. Now I want to talk to you for a few minutes about what this story is actually about. Because from the outside, it looks like a story about money and wills and a family that showed its hand. I do not think it is about any of those things. I think it is about a sentence. You are the strong one. I spent my entire childhood being called the strong one. And here is what that phrase does to a person over time. It teaches you to manage your needs in private, to absorb damage without showing the cost, to be, in every room, the one who handles it. Even rooms where you are supposed to be the one being cared for. And the people who call you strong, who depend on it, who organize their comfort around your reliability, they genuinely believe they are paying you a compliment. They do not understand that they have handed you a bill with no ceiling and no payment due date. Here is what I know now that I did not know for most of my life. Strength is not the absence of need. Strength is what you do when you have needs and you meet them honestly, without managing other people's comfort in the process. The people who raised me taught me that my needs were inconvenient, that asking was weakness, that the best version of me was the version that cost them the least. That is not strength. That is compliance, with a flattering word attached. The second thing I know, the people who show up when it costs them something are telling you something that cannot be manufactured. At hospital at 3 in the morning, with real coffee, because I needed someone, and that is who she is. Tom Greer drove to my house at midnight to feed my dog because he got a text, and that is what you do. And Arthur Hayes, a man who had run a company with 1,400 employees, has been investigated by the FBI and built a fortune out of a single second-hand truck, drove 45 minutes to a hospital room with a gas station sandwich and a deck of cards, and sat beside me in a plastic chair without making it about himself, because I was his, and his people he showed up for. The third thing, you are the strong one in your family, the one who handles everything, the one who does not ask, the one who is always available and never gets the phone call returned. I want to say something to you directly. You were not born that way. You were trained to need less by people who found your needs inconvenient. And somewhere along the way, you accepted the training so completely that you started calling it your identity. I did the same thing for 38 years. The accident cracked it open. The hospital room made it impossible to ignore. And my grandfather, who had watched it happening for decades with the quiet anger of a man who loved me and could not fix what my parents had done, found the one way available to him at the end of his life to make the record reflect the truth. You were never too much. You were told you were too much by people who had already decided what they were willing to give. Those are not the same statement. And your entire life may have been shaped by not being able to see the difference. Pay attention to who shows up when it costs them something. Build the record. Keep it. Because life has a habit, eventually, of requiring evidence. And the person who has been building their evidence quietly, while everyone else has been spending what does not belong to them yet, that person does not have to fight when the moment comes. They just have to walk into the room and let the preparations speak. That was what Arthur Hayes left me. Not the land, not the money, not the investment accounts. The standard. One simple way to evaluate every relationship for the rest of my life. Who showed up? Take notes. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in it felt like a sentence you have been waiting to hear, I would genuinely love to know. Leave a comment. Tell me about the person who showed up for you when it cost them something. Tell me about the 3 in the morning phone call that actually got answered. Or tell me if you are the strong one. If you have been adapting yourself down to a size that fits other people's comfort for so long that you have forgotten what you actually need. I read every single comment. If you are new here, welcome. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Not drama for the sake of drama. Stories that ask harder questions than they answer. And if you know someone who has been carrying too much for too long, share this with them. Not as a message, just as a reminder. They have earned the right to put it down. This story is a dramatized narrative. Names and identifying details have been changed for privacy. It is not intended as legal or financial advice. If you are navigating estate disputes or family legal matters, please consult a licensed attorney in your state. Take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next one.
Before you go, I want to leave you with something. Not a summary, not a list of takeaways. Just a few things I genuinely believe after sitting with this story for a long time. The first is this. Every family has a version of the strong one. The person who manages, who absorbs, who figures it out, who never asks twice. And most families treat that person's reliability as a permanent resource with no maintenance required. What nobody tells you is that there is a cost to that role. It accumulates quietly, over years, the way water damage works inside a wall. You cannot see it from the outside. Everything looks fine. And then, one day, something small happens. A phone call from a hospital room at 1 in the morning. And the whole structure reveals itself. The damage was always there. It just finally had a reason to show. The second thing is about evidence. Arthur Hayes was not a sentimental man. He did not leave behind journals or love letters or long speeches about family values. He left behind documentation, visitor logs, signed statements, recorded conversations, a forensic file that took 2 years to build. And I think about that often, not because I believe everyone should walk around collecting evidence on their families, but because there is something deeply honest about what he did. He paid attention. He wrote it down. He trusted the record over the story. And in the end, the record was the only thing that mattered. Most of us spend our lives trying to manage the story of who we are to our families, who our families are to us, what we owe each other, what we deserve. We negotiate that story constantly, revising it, softening it, giving people the benefit of the doubt, again and again, because the alternative is too painful to look at directly. Arthur Hayes stopped negotiating the story. He just kept the record. There is a kind of freedom in that. Not a cold freedom, not an unloving one, just the specific freedom that comes from deciding that what actually happened is more important than what you wish had happened. The third thing, and this is the one I want you to carry with you. The people who show up when it costs them something are not ordinary. They are extraordinary. Quietly, without announcement, without needing credit for it, they are the most extraordinary people in your life. Carol Bennett drove to a hospital at 3 in the morning with real coffee. Tom Greer fed a dog at midnight because someone sent a text. Arthur Hayes, at 82 years old, drove 45 minutes with a gas station sandwich and a deck of cards, and sat in a plastic chair beside a hospital bed and dealt 2 hands of gin rummy without asking if I wanted to play, because I was his, and his people he showed up for. Find your people. Show up for them. Keep the record of who shows up for you, and stop spending your strength on people who have decided it is an unlimited resource they are entitled to draw from without ever replenishing. You are not a utility. You are a person, and the right people already know the difference. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I will see you in the next one. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually crafted by our team with one purpose only: to bring you stories that carry real meaning, real lessons, and real value. Every word in this story was chosen intentionally, not to entertain for a moment, but to stay with you long after the video ends. We hope it did exactly that.